Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today we're going to talk about the series that I have binged in the past few months, that is my current obsession, that I love so much, that I expected to love before I started it, but I didn't expect to become one of my favorite series of all time. And the series that I'm talking about is A Chorus of Dragons by Jen Lyons. So this is a series review, or rather a series gush, that we're gonna talk about today. I'm gonna talk about the first 4 books in the series. This is not yet a completed series. The 5th and last book is gonna be published next year, but I can't wait that long to talk about it. So here we are. This is an adult high fantasy series so far consisting of The Ruin of Kings, The Name of All Things, The Memory of Souls, and The House of Always. And I kind of regret getting the paperbacks of this because this is one of the few series where I'd really appreciate having the entire series as hardcovers, even though I prefer paperbacks usually. But since this is a long series and it's heavy, and I got my vaccine yesterday, so my arm is hurting, for once I'm not gonna hold up the series the entire time, but I'm gonna set them up behind me. So now that all of the books are set up behind me, we're gonna hope that they won't fall down while I talk about the series, while I talk about why I love this series so much, why I have become so obsessed with this series. We're also gonna talk about some negative things, kind of. I don't really find them negative, but I can see why other people might find them negative. And we won't talk about what the series is about because, you know, the basic summary is very basic in terms of high fantasy. I don't think the story itself is that unique, or, you know, the summary. I think for some reason fantasy series, they are so big, so when you break them down to a summary, they don't sound as interesting as they actually are. But for those of you who want a basic synopsis of the series, basically, we follow a bunch of characters who are central to a prophecy. The prophecy, as prophecies happen to be, is about the end of the world. However, the people within the prophecy aren't prophesied to save the world, but to destroy the world. And so, yeah, that's what the series is about. Now let me get into talking about this series. So in this video I won't have my usual structure of negative positive, because to be honest, most of the things that I think some people might consider as negative I really loved and found unique writing choices, so I will talk about those things in a positive light as well. So what I decided to do instead is to kind of structure this review in a, you know, plot, setup, world building, characters type of way. And let's start maybe with the setup, because I think the way this story is written is quite unique and I need to make the setup clear before I talk about some of the other stuff. So the way this series is set up is that each book actually is kind of an account of what happened. So each book has in a way a different author that is a character within the world, and because of that you also get footnotes by said author, and they are mostly just either, you know, inserting the personality of the author and kind of just commentary on what was happening, or they are little tidbits on the world building. And I am personally not a fan of footnotes. I have said that a lot of times already. I usually, when it comes to footnotes, I go the route that a lot of my professors at uni go, and that is to say, if it has to be said in a footnote, if it can't be said in the proper text, then it probably doesn't need to be there. However, in this series, I had to get warm a little bit in the first book. I thought the footnotes in the first book were probably the most boring, but like as the series went on, I started to really appreciate the footnotes because you get a lot of personality, you get a lot of fun commentary. It's, you know, it's just hilarious. You sometimes get the footnotes pointing out like, remember that thing that just happened because that's gonna be important in the future. And yeah, I just thought the footnotes mostly were really fun and helpful. Then the second way this series was written, which I found really interesting and which I really appreciated because it kind of, you know, helped break up the usual fantasy story plot arc set up was that most of the books, actually all of the books, are written in a way where you have one timeline that is whatever is currently happening, and then you have a second timeline, or sometimes even a third timeline, but you have a second timeline that is stuff that happened in the past leading up to whatever is currently happening. And that can be a little bit confusing sometimes, although in general I would say that most of the chapters it is made quite clear like what timeline this chapter currently belongs to and why it's important to talk about this right now. And I just thought it really helped with world building, because you're not just given everything off of the bat, but you're kind of given the information bit by bit and as it's important, which sometimes led to confusion on my part. So I think this series is a series that you have to be, you know, firmly within reading adult high fantasy already, where you don't have to know everything about the world building already, because, you know, you're given it bit by bit, but then sometimes you're given chunks of information at once and it's like, oh my god, what's happening right now? But it'll all make sense sooner or later. So yeah, but definitely already be familiar with the confusion that adult high fantasy world building can sometimes bring you. But yeah, now back to the timelines. You usually get a past timeline and a present timeline, and at the end of the book those two timelines almost always merge, so that's what I really appreciated. It's not like something that happened in the far past, but the past stuff that happens does very much connect to what is currently happening in the book. Something else that I really appreciated was in terms of the characters, in terms of how the characters were introduced. You have the first book, which is mostly our main characters, Kieran's point of view. Again, you have Kieran's present and his past, and you're introduced to him, and you're also introduced to side characters that are important to his story. In the second book then, you're introduced to a new character. You're introduced to her past, although the present stuff is still Kieran's point of view, and you're introduced in the past chapters to characters that are important to her story. And then when the third book comes around, you basically introduced to all the characters. You know all of them already, so you get a lot of different POVs suddenly, because you now know all the characters. And I do really appreciate that in series when characters are slowly introduced, when in adult high fantasy a lot of times you can have a huge cast of characters. And if you're introduced to all of these characters right at once, right off the bat, that can be very confusing. You sometimes don't really remember all of the characters. You might have troubles properly setting up all the characters, all the motivations of all the characters. So I do very much appreciate it when we're just slowly introduced to one character at a time, or a few characters at a time, so that we can get to grow to know them. And then once we know them, more characters are introduced. And actually a similar thing also happens when it comes to the world building, where each of the books is kind of set in a different part of the world, and you're just slowly introduced to different cultures within the world. And, you know, that's also something that I really appreciate. We don't spend each book in the same setting. The settings change very much. And so yeah, I just thought overall the setup of this series is absolutely brilliant. It's different from anything I have ever read before in fantasy. And since I have read a lot of fantasy books already, that's, you know, something to really point out. However, I also do have to point out that, you know, it could sometimes be a little bit confusing with all the different elements in the story, with the fact that it's not really chronologically told and so on. And I did basically finish the first book with the feeling of, I love this, but I don't really know what happened right now. So I do think I'm gonna have to reread the entire series before I read the fifth and last book, which comes out next year, and I think it will make a lot more sense then. But that's also something that I personally really appreciate. I appreciate stories not that confuse me. It's weird to say I appreciate stories that confuse me, but I appreciate stories that have enough substance that keep me hooked. but that I maybe will have to read a second time to completely get. But I personally, I'm a rereader. I also don't read books very closely a lot of times, so a lot of times for me, the way I read, I might easily miss information that might help me understand some stuff. But yeah, so I absolutely found the setup brilliant, and I think the second reread, or the first reread, on a reread, I'll love this series even more. But I might just do a whole series review next year again and then tell you what I thought of the series on a reread. So second, let's talk about the world building, because the world building in this series is brilliant and it does so many things that I would wish fantasy did more, but it doesn't do enough. And that is just using magic, just using the fantastical to do things that wouldn't make sense in our world. And, you know, to create cultures that wouldn't work as they are within the fantasy world in our world. What I mean by that is that especially when it comes to queerness, there are so many elements in this series where I'm like, yes, please, more of that in fantasy. Use fantasy to explore the different possibilities of gender identity, of sexuality, and so on. It's like, there's so much. I'm gonna have a whole series around queerness in fantasy, which I will upload in June. It's gonna be 3 videos in total on sexuality, on gender identity, and then also on gender roles and gender expression. But to now talk about something a little bit that I'm gonna talk about in this series as well, something I have not a problem with, because having a problem with something is such a negative connotation, but something I would wish fantasy did more is not just look at what we now today within mostly even just a Western context understand queerness to be, understand transness to be, or whatever, but to look at the fantasy worlds, to look at what is possible within the fantasy worlds, and to then use that to kind of define what queerness means within the context of the series. Not within a Western modern context, because, you know, what queerness is, what gender identity is, what sexuality is different even from culture to culture. And, you know, our understanding of what a trans person is very specific to the time and culture that we live in. And so I think there's so many possibilities within fantasy to just expand that, to not just kind of copy paste from our world, but to look again within the context of the world that is created and what that might mean, and then work with that. And that's what this series does brilliantly. For example, you have a culture within this world that we're introduced to in the second book, where you have a very distinct difference between the biological or the physical sex and then the social gender. And these two don't have to fit together, they don't have to align. And if they don't align, some people can choose via magic to change their physical sex to align with their social gender, but not everyone wants to do that. For example, one of our main characters is a woman, physically a woman, but her social gender would be seen as male. However, she doesn't care if she's called she, her, she doesn't care that her body is a woman. It's like, you know, it doesn't matter. And so it's interesting because within our world, within our modern context, I struggle, you know, would we call her transgender? Would we call her non-binary? What identity does she fall into? But ultimately it doesn't really matter, because we don't need to understand what her identity is within our world. But, you know, it's only important what she is within the context of her own world. And of course, you can ask questions in terms of, you know, representation. Is that representation or not? But, you know, I think queerness doesn't always one-to-one have to be representation from our world within fantasy, but it can just be its own thing. And so you have a lot of queerness in this world building that absolutely would not work in our world, that absolutely is not what we understand queerness to be in a modern Western context. But, you know, I would still see it as queer world building, as queer representation, and I absolutely love that. You know, from sex changing to body changing to whatever. Also, just in general, and I mean, it's kind of more important with characters, and I'm gonna talk about that in characters again probably, but there are no straight characters in this series, like basically no straight characters. I went through all the characters that we see a lot of in the last book, or the latest book, and one of them, maybe two of them, were characters where I'm like, I think they're straight, or at least they're not confirmed queer. For fuck's sake, even the fucking undead Kraken has a dragon who's her girlfriend. You know, even the Kraken and the dragon are sapphic. But yeah, so world building in terms of queerness, absolutely amazing. One of the best world buildings that I've ever seen. And as much as I love to see representation from our world, or one-to-one representation from our world, experiences from our world translated to fantasy, I love it even more if, you know, whatever the context of the world is worked with. So yeah, absolutely love that. So yeah, that's the first thing about the world building that I absolutely love. And the second thing is just there's so many layers to the world building. There's some elements that we're quite familiar with from, you know, fantasy tropes, but mostly the world building that I found in this series was quite unique and unlike anything I had ever seen before, and I really appreciated it. Also, I absolutely love this because within this series there's resurrections, there's reincarnations, and there's body swapping, which, you know, just makes the characters and the interactions, the dynamics between the characters really interesting. And it also brings a lot of mystery to the table, especially in the first and the second books. And so yeah, I just absolutely loved the world building in this series. Then the third thing I want to talk about is the plot. And plot-wise, I don't have that much to say, to be honest, because I think the plot is probably, I don't want to say the weakest part of the story, but the least strong part of the story, because, you know, the setup is so unique, the world building has some absolutely brilliant aspects, as I already said, and the characters I'm gonna talk about or gush about still, so the characters are absolutely amazing as well. So the plot, while I did love the plot, it's the thing that stands out the least to me when I want to talk about this series. However, something I do really love is that in terms of the plot, we have something similar to the characters, where I said the first two books are kind of, you know, smaller scale, and then in the last two books you get to see more of the big picture, and we finally start properly working towards our final plot. Because the first two books are mostly, you know, concerning the past. The first book does have quite a bit of plot that is set in the present as well, but that plot in the present kind of sets up the future big goal. It's not directly working towards the future big goal yet, which again I also appreciate. I appreciate when the first book is kind of set apart a little bit so we can get to know the characters and so on, and then in the second book again we need to meet new characters, so it's also not yet properly directed towards the future big goal and just kind of, you know, adjacent to the plot that's gonna be the big plot. So yeah, I do love that we go from more small scale stuff to bigger scale stuff later on. And then lastly, let me talk about the characters, because oh my god, I love the characters so much. The characters have become some of my favorite characters of all time, definitely. Especially Kieran. Kieran is our main character. He is the epitome of a disaster bisexual. He is the epitome of a disaster bisexual coming to terms with his sexuality, and that oops, that one guy that I kind of hate is actually really hot. which, you know, is just amazing. Also, Kieran is a cinnamon roll. He is stupid, but you know, he's the kind of stupid that is very endearing and not the kind of stupid where you're like, why the fuck are you this stupid? I don't like that you're this stupid. Because he's a very, very, you know, classical adult high fantasy chosen one hero in a way, who feels like he needs to save everyone, which could be annoying, to be honest, in another book series. But he has enough people in this series calling him out constantly that it just makes his character arc absolutely beautiful, because he doesn't learn. He goes through a lot of character development, but he doesn't learn. I know that's kind of counterintuitive to say both that he doesn't learn and he has a lot of character development, but I don't know how else to describe his arc. But yeah, it's just peak disaster bisexual and just constantly going, shit, I should not have done this. I mean, my favorite character is probably Tereth, who is constantly done with Kieran's bullshit, but yet loves him so much. I love Tereth. I don't even know what to say about him. He's Tereth. He's an amazing, immortal, done with everyone character who has so much love to give as well. And then, yeah, it's just, all the characters are really lovable, even the characters you really don't like. There's a lot of characters where I'm like, I really don't like you. You're just like a morally fucked up person, but you know, I also kind of really appreciate you. And I need to change my battery. So yeah, I'm back. Anyways, the characters. I love the morally grey, morally black characters that I absolutely cannot get behind, that I somehow still sympathize with. I don't know why. There's some really fucked up shit in this series. Like, you know, if you only want romances that are squeaky clean, don't read this series, because there's some romances that, you know, are pretty toxic, and it is called out that they're pretty toxic, but you know, they sometimes still end up being endgame, because why not? They're just some fucked up people in fucked up romances. That's what it is. Also, there's polyamory in this series, which, oh my god, I love my disaster throuple. They are so great. There's also on-page explicit ace rap within the main characters, which I really appreciate as well. As I said, pretty much all the characters are some type of queer, and every single book gets queerer and queerer, and you have a main character who is male and who is bisexual, which we definitely do not get to see a lot of, which I really appreciate. There's the lesbianism, there's the bisexuality, there's all the gay stuff, there's all the ace stuff. It's just, you know, the characters are amazing. I mean, I know right now I'm only talking about how queer the characters are, but you know, that's synonyms. Queerness and amazingness, just all the same. But you know, it's just, I have this thing about the characters. When I love something a lot, I lose the ability to talk about why I love this thing so much, because my heart just goes boom boom, and it's just like, oh my god, I love them so much. So yeah, just take it from me that the characters are the best part of the series, please. I mean, I have heard that people think Kieran is annoying, but I don't get why anyone would think that, like, at all. I don't know. Also, literally all the characters are pretty fucked up. Aside from Kieran, maybe. I don't know. But, you know, all the characters either belong to some assassins, cults, or they are mass murderers, or they have been mass murderers in past lives, because, again, reincarnations, body swapping, which makes the dynamics between the characters a lot of fun, because you just go like, wait, how is that person related to them? Like, who was whom and what? What is going on? There's some reincarnations of people who were other people's arch nemesis, and now they are their children, and things going on, and it's a lot of fun. It's so much fun. And then the last thing I want to talk about that I really appreciate, because we do not get enough of that just in general in fiction, in reality. We do not talk about that enough. And that is that there is not an explicit rape scene within this series, but there is an instance where a male character is raped by a female character and afterwards talks about it to another person. And he's like, you know, I could have just said, no, I'm the man, I'm the stronger person, I could have just pushed him away or whatever. But it is still stated explicitly that nope, what happened was still rape. So yeah, I really appreciated that. Also, if you're very sensitive to certain triggers, on Jen Lyon's website, she kind of has pages that are called AO3 tags for each book, where she first tags trigger warnings. There are spoilers in there though, like more spoilers than I would just count, you know, trigger warning for rape or trigger warning for sexual assault. There are some very specific spoilers in there. Just like on AO3, you get a lot more specific with tags a lot of times than just, you know, your general trigger warnings. And then she just, you know, has an AO3 style tag list for all the other stuff. Like, oops, my romantic rival is kind of hot as a tag. You know, those types of tags are on there as well. So yeah, if you're interested, definitely check that out, because I cannot think of all the triggers off the top of my head. I just in general have problems a lot of times thinking of triggers, because I am not a person who is triggered by pretty much anything, so I might easily oversee a lot of triggers. But you know, the thing that I can think off the top of my head that I would definitely be wary about when you go into this series is sexual assault, and then also just all the death related triggers. Also homophobia a little bit, because there is a culture that is rather homophobic. But yeah, I think that was all I wanted to say about the series. As I said, it's amazing, I love it, go and read it, because I am so obsessed with it. But yeah, if you have read the series and have some thoughts you want to share, please share them in the comments. Also, if you have not read the series and you have some more questions, ask them in the comments and I will probably answer them. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where we read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month, will also be left in the description box down below. Since June is coming around, in June we're reading The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri. So if you're interested in tagging along, to Twitter, the Discord, everything down below, as I said, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye. Also, read this book series. Like, seriously, you won't regret it.